more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles.
Well, Julia, today is a fantastic day because we are continuing on not only on the BJCP guidelines, but we're heading into a completely different beer region in the world. And we're getting into really the UK in all fairness. Or basically, we're just going to talk about the British bitters. There's so much overlap between these beers that we're just going to talk about them all in their entirety. We're going to talk about the ordinary bitter. We're going to talk about the best bitter, and we're going to talk about the strong bitter from England. It's important to note with these that, first of all, cheers to everyone listening, and especially you, Julia, with our beer in her hand. It's important to understand that we're referencing the 2021 BJCP style guidelines, and when we talk about the British bitters, so these categories are written specifically for draft beer. Now, when we talk about these beers on draft, we're really talking about cask ale or real ale pulled with a British beer engine. So please understand that these are referencing the draft beer. If you get these beers in can or in bottle, they tend to be fuller in body. They tend to be more carbonated. They tend to even be a little bit on the sweeter side, both in body and in flavor. So just understand just the nuance of draft versus packaged beer within the British bitter category. And I think that's something I forget about all the time. But it's important that we remember that there is a subtle distinction, enough of a distinction between the two.
Yeah.
But these beers that we're talking about really are the pale ales of the UK, pale ales of Britain. They call them bitter, but by American standards, they're not really all that bitter. But quote unquote, back in the day, they were more bitter than other beers that you could get your hands on. And there's an emphasis, especially on the draft beers, there's an emphasis on hop balance on these. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into ingredients, about how these flavors manifest. But Julia, I need to take a sip of my beer. You want to talk about the ingredients, about the beers that go into these beers?
Why, yes, I do. As I just took a sip of a homebrew that represents this British beer style.
Ooh, nice.
And I won't reveal which variant of the ordinary bitter, best bitter, right? And then you have the third element of this style, which is strong bitter. Mm-hmm. And so ingredient wise, there's a little bit of nuance, but based on varying degrees, the only I would say bigger emphasis of nuance for different ingredients would be darker color. So most of them obviously will have pale or amber malt with some crystal malt. Crystal malt being a non-fermentable malt, but going to give you some essence of color and a little bit of flavor introduction. And then as you get to different degrees or examples of this, you might even have darker malts that the brewer intended to have it be darker. We'll talk about the color ranges in a little bit. You're also going to have something that dries these out. It's a fermentable, but it's not malted barley. It's sugar. So sugar adjuncts can be added. Corn is common. You also could have wheat as another form of a fermentable to give it body. So hops too, all of them will call for and obviously encourage and allow English hops, particularly with some flavor introduction from those hops, not just bittering agents. But believe it or not, the style guidelines also allow for hops from anywhere, including American hops, although you'd want a light hand. You wouldn't want those American hops to be doing much more than adding more of the bittering agents as opposed to the flavoring agents. So the British yeast or English ale yeast will have a certain characteristic of esters that these styles, the British bitters, are known for fermenting at warmer ale yeast temperatures. And then, Jeremy, we can't not talk about the water, right? And so the water from the region in the UK region where these beers originated is certainly going to have a certain level of sulfites and carbonate content,
Mm-hmm.
is going to give these beers a little more emphasis and snap of bitterness and a little bit more of a mouthfeel, depending on which region, frankly, you are brewing it in. So water is always important to pay attention to when you're brewing these beers, and you might notice influence from the water when you're tasting them.
Yeah,
And
and that's definitely going to take those ingredients and affect how they manifest, affect how they come across. And I always think of it as it's like a camera, and you're bringing, just by twisting the lens, you're bringing different flavors in and out of focus. This water that you're talking about, the sulfates that will bring those hops into a sharper focus. It's not going to make them harsh. It's just going to bring them out on the forefront just a little bit more, even though these are can be considered multi-styles. It's a beautiful thing of chemistry and process that these brewers have mastered over hundreds of years.
yes, with water being a key ingredient of that.
Absolutely.
So talk us to appearance, so then we can finally get to aroma and flavor.
I know. Let's get to the good stuff. So appearance-wise, now remember, for stylistically, when we're looking at these styles, we're talking about draft beer. So imagine, for those of you who have seen this, have experienced this, and even for those of you who haven't, look it up on YouTube. But there's beer engine with a gooseneck sparkler, and this is the one time when it is okay to bury your wand into the beer as you're pouring the glass. You want to get that sparkler at the very bottom of the glass and basically fill it from the bottom. And that's going to create this beautiful foam that is the reason why that nitro was invented, was to mimic this cask ale experience. And so you're going to have this beautiful foamy glass initially if it's done well and done right. But that head isn't going to stick around for very long because per the draft styles, it's not highly carbonated. It's actually low. There is carbonation, but it's lightly effervescent. So it's not going to stick around very long. Color-wise, you can get pale to amber to light copper, and all three styles, the ordinary, the best, and the strong bitter, occupy pretty much the same space with slight variation. We'll talk about that in the vital stats in a minute. But they really are kind of a pale amber, dark gold, all the way up to kind of solid into copper land, if you will. The clarity should always be very clear, brilliant. The head should be kind of light to medium off-white. But again, you may not have a persistent head. This is for those of you watching the video, I've got a glass with a beautiful copper colored beer, and I poured the beer just a few minutes ago, and now the head is gone. And you know what? That's okay. That's part of the nature of beers when they're done in this manner within the cask ale. But in a nutshell, that is all three of those categories. They're very, very similar in color. How about the aroma, Julia?
So again, we're talking about British beer from the Beer Judge Certification Program Style Guidelines 2021 version. And you've got three in the mix. You've got ordinary bitter, best bitter, and strong bitter. When it comes to aroma and flavor, I'm going to talk ordinary bitter and best bitter, and then talk about the nuance and the difference for strong bitter being the most aggressive of the three of these British bitters. Low to moderate malt aroma, which should be a little surprising because it's really all about the malt, mostly in this beer. And then, light caramel notes from that crystal malt that's often used in brewing it. And I remember sitting, Jeremy, for Master Cicerone, saying in an essay, I need 10 different ways to say caramel. Because caramel comes up so often in sensory when you are tasting malted barley that has been kilned or lightly roasted. But caramel is caramel. Think a caramel candy, but without that big hit of sweetness. And that's the caramel you're looking for from the malted barley in these beers. And then bready, biscuity. I love those descriptors. Lightly toasted. I mean, that means lightly, not heavily toasted. And then you've got, some fruitiness from the yeast. That fruitiness can be, I often call it unripe raspberries or unripe strawberries, low esters from that British ale yeast. And then the hop aroma is typical classic hops from the UK. If you are truly getting an example that's using hops that are about flavor and aroma, and that's going to give you earthy. The word resiny is allowed and chosen in here. I think earthy is one of the most indicative flavor profiles and aroma profiles for English style hops. And then no diacetyl. Diacetyl is a viconyl diketone, VDK, and that is a chemical offshoot of yeast fermentation. Not to make it too complicated, but it basically can be an advanced butterscotch flavors. The style guidelines are saying that generally we're not having diacetyl, although you are allowed to have a little bit of diacetyl.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, and in the aroma, that's going to come off as like buttered popcorn or low level butter.
Yeah, and frankly, if it's real low, I don't mind a little bit of that in my glass. It's actually kind of nice, but that's just me.
I totally agree. Yeah, and then flavor.
Flavor wise, we're not. I'm just gonna say what she said. This is across the board between the ordinary, the best, and the strong. We do have, especially in ordinary and best, we do have that low to medium malt, that low to medium caramel toffee, that the medium to medium high bitterness. As far as the flavors that I expect to get, I've had lots of different British beers of this nature, and there are times I get more caramel. There are times I get a little bit more toffee. There are times I've had some that remind me of like toasted cashews. That can be just this sweet nuttiness that is just wonderful. When the hops come through, Julia, like you said, any hop is okay to use in this beer, technically speaking. However, I'm just going to go on a ledge and say, I expect, if I'm getting a British style beer, I expect British style hops. I'm not always going to get what I want, but if I get British style hops, we talked about earth, but I would even go even deeper into, it's like a wet coastal earth, like a dark earth, like a soil that is just lovely. Sometimes I get like a river stone, a minerality. Sometimes I get a little bit of like a black tea, and I love it when I get, I'm not sure which hop this is, but sometimes I'll get just a little touch of orange marmalade in some of these hops too. And it's just fantastic. I love that stuff. But you mentioned, the diacetyl, a little bit is okay. It should never be harsh. It should never be overly sulfury. But even in a stronger bitter, now we start talking about a little bit of alcohol. You can get some medium low to high esters. There's a big range there, but the alcohol, you can get a little pop of alcohol in a strong bitter, and that's where just from the alcohol alone. And we'll talk about the stats and why that is in a minute, but that's where we're going to start introducing a little bit of that flavor. But that's the taste. How's it going to feel on our palate?
I love that you did emphasize the alcohol, especially getting to the strong bitter. Mouthfeel, key component, and again, the kind of brother, sister, ordinary bitter, best bitter fit together more in the very specific same guidelines for mouthfeel. Light to medium, light body. Low carbonation, that would reflect those real ale or cask condition style beers. And then bottled examples will have more carbonation. That is what's going on for mouthfeel and ordinary and best bitter. And then you get to mouthfeel for the strong bitter because it's a little bit more in girth for the alcohol level. You've got medium light to medium full body, right? You've got a little more residual sugar as well that's going to increase and enhance that mouthfeel. The carbonation should, I guess, be similar. The guidelines say low to moderate, but bottled versions obviously could and would have higher examples. And then that alcohol in the increased version of a strong bitter will give you more of a sense of mouthfeel, a little bit more weight on the tongue.
Yeah. So when we talk about these beers, we can talk about the style comparisons.
Mm-hmm.
I know these beers are brewed all over the world. So first of all, we can compare them to each other. Ordinary bitter, best bitter, and strong bitter. We can compare those to each other first and foremost. Obviously, the ordinary bitter is going to be the younger, smaller sibling in that family. And with the best bitter, being just, a step up from that. And then the strong bitter, kind of a step and a half up. There's a little bit more separation there from my experience. But now we need to compare these besides just to each other, but we can compare them to the American style pale ales, for example. And so first of all, we need to talk about, granted, any hops are allowed within the style, but if I were to place my bets and use the house odds, chances are you're going to have British style ingredients in these more often than not. So comparing these beers to American styles, there's going to be more emphasis on the malt in the British style beers, and there's going to be, when it comes to the hops, there's going to be more emphasis on the bittering of these hops, or use of bitter hops. Whereas American style hops, wherever they're brewed, there's more emphasis on middle additions, late additions, dry hopping, because we Americans, we love our grapefruit and our pine trees, and so these British style beers are going to just be a little bit more subtle. And if I could pigeonhole UK styles, from my experience, is they are the kings of subtlety, and so these are not going to shout from the rooftops like American beers do. These are going to be very staid in their flavor profiles.
And how very English of the
Yes.
the way these styles do, the
Stiff
nuances
upper lip.
there, the reserved nature. No
Yep.
need to scream it from the rooftops. You'll still fall in love with every one of these British bitters.
Every one of them.
Right.
But what about the commercial examples, Julia?
Commercial examples are super fun, and over the years, these are somewhat easier to find. You've got Tetley's Ordinary Bitter. I certainly recall having that. What I loved about it was just so sessionable. 3.6% alcohol was the version that I had. Lots of sweet malt. Had it on nitro. Very mild, but sweet is my notes. So that's a great example of an ordinary bitter. And then you get into best bitter, that middle class, the Jan Brady of the group, we shall say, if you've ever watched Brady Brunch as an American. Harvey's Sussex Best Bitter comes to mind, and there are a lot of examples out there, especially if you are touring the UK, that are great. And then I'll toss out for the strong bitter, an actual American example, will be Summit Extra Pale Ale. Summit out of the Northeast in the United States, an amazing brewery, and their Extra Pale Ale is, frankly, I believe, one of their flagships, and it's just still around today, showcasing what a strong bitter can be. Or your classic Bass Ale is a good way that a lot of people cut their teeth on this.
Yep.
There's a lot of talk about the Fullers. There's many variants of the Fullers within these three categories for different brands. Fullers tends to be more aggressive and not a exact example, but yet Fullers in the United States region where Jeremy and I reside, unfortunately has set the stage and tone for how everyone thinks about these British bitters. And it's really just not the only example, often more aggressive too.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because everyone thinks ESB, extra special bitter, and that is a beer specific to Fuller's and the beer style. I mean, one of my first favorite beers when I started drinking beer was an ESB, because all American craft breweries, microbreweries back then, brewed an ESB. Well, it's actually a strong bitter. ESB is a very specific beer, so I kind of want to give a little credence to Fuller's and say, that is your beer. We're going to drink the strong bitters. And I do have, I'm going to show on my screen, and I'll talk about it for those of you listening. I did find Jester King out of Austin, Texas, normally makes some incredible sours, and some really good lagers, but I did find that they actually brewed a English style summer ale, which follows that ordinary bitter at 3.5%. And one that used to be on the strong bitter guidelines that I kind of want to keep on there if it were up to me is the Old Spreckled Hen. And that's another one that is not not terribly difficult to find in places that have good options there. Another one I found is anyone who listened to Iron Maiden back in the day. Well, the lead singer started a brewery, and now it's the Trooper, the Robinson's Trooper. That's another one that's easier to find these days. Those are just fun beers to find, but they're not difficult to find. So go try them and taste them, but understand the difference between draft and can. But I'm going to jump over to the vital stats. The thing I love about these and the way that I approached my study for Advanced Cicerone is I needed to look at these as a pattern. And so let's start out with the ABVs on this. The ordinary bitter is basically a session ale by what most of us would consider session ale. It's from 3.2 to 3.8. So it is squarely in the 3% range of 3.2 to 3.8. The nice thing is the best bitter is just a stair step from 3.8 to 4.6. And then from there, the strong bitter is 4.6 to 6.2. There's a pattern there. There are stair steps where the ranges kind of overlap, which can be a little bit confusing if you want to get technical, but there's no need to. As far as the IBUs, we're all really, really, really close. These tend to be more hop forward beers than we had previously talked about with the German beers. So we're talking 25 to 35 IBUs. And with the best bitter, again, 25 to 40, a slight step there because it's a slightly bigger beer. But a strong bitter, the more alcohol, more ingredients, we're getting from 30 to 50. So there's a pattern there. As the stronger we get, slightly more hops. With the color, in America with the SRM, we're occupying, they're all pretty much the same. We're talking about kind of like a dark gold, light amber, all the way to copper. So from 8 to 14 for ordinary, 8 to 16 for best, and strong bitters 8 to 18. I think of 15 is squarely in copper, and so these are skirting that around there. Of course, with EBC, we double those numbers, and so we go from 16 to 28 for ordinary, and 16 to 32 for best, and strong is 16 to, what's the math? 18, 36. And that's how you can look at the stuff, but they're all right in the same ballpark. So there's not that much difference there. But of course, the gravities, they're going to be commensurate with the ABV. They're going to be commensurate with the body. The original gravity for ordinary is 1030 to 1039. Real low sessionable beer. Best bitter, there's a pattern here. 1040 to 1048 for best, and 1048 to 1060 for the strong. The thing that we keep on talking about every episode is that it's the final gravity that has more of a story to tell. And I always use 1010 as that fence, and I lean either way. If it's less than 1010 for final gravity, then it's going to be lighter in body. So the ordinary bitter is 10.7 to 10.11. So it skirts that fence. And with the best bitter, 10.08 to 10.12, and strong bitter 10.10 to 10.16. And of course, you can translate this into Plato by taking those numbers and multiplying it by 4. So strong bitter 10.10, we're going to take that last number of 10 and multiply it by 4. So it's Plato of 4, if I'm doing that math right. I don't use Plato very often, so I need to look at a scale for that. But the Platos are going to be commensurate with the final gravity because it's just a factor of 4. The other interesting thing that we need to talk about is the volumes of CO2. These are all going to, a normal beer that you can expect to drink is right around the range of 2.5, somewhere around there. As a cask conditioned ale, the cask ale is beer that was fermented in a vessel and dispensed from that same vessel without the use of extra carbon dioxide. So the volumes of CO2 for these beers is really low, down to like the 1 volume of CO2. It's not the flat warm beers that some people say. It's just lightly effervescent and a completely different experience. These are the numbers that coordinate with all the stuff, and just a way to think about them, the way to find the patterns so that they're more memorable rather than just being a bunch of numbers on the page. And that worked really well for me.
Very, very well described. And a lot of the patterns that you identified is what helps me. I talk about 7-Eleven, a American convenience store, and this is definitely one that I would go to get an ordinary bitter at, and that anchors you at the final gravity of 10,007 to 1011. So there's a starting point for sure.
Yeah, nice.
And I would love to lead us into ideal glassware and temperature. And then, Jeremy, I want to quickly spend some bandwidth after you talk about that glass, or show us that glass while I talk about it, to pairing examples, because I've got a great one, and I even want to read an excerpt from my beer pairing book. So
I love it.
On glassware, what Jeremy's holding is a no-nick pint. This is a classic pub pint glass, very utilitarian centric, meaning meant for stacking, chips not as easily. When I say no-nick, it means not nicking in one form of explaining what it is. It's a classic English pint, often 20 ounces though. So even though English approach is more understated, more reserved, your pint glass is bigger than the 16-ounce shaker pint.
They're not that shy.
Yeah, so there's something to be said about that. I love a good no-nick full with an English bitter, because it's less time to wait for the waiter to get there because you have more to sip. And also your hand is holding it in more of the surface area of that glass. That gets to the serving temperature. These beers, based on being authentically real ale, often served only from draft, not from the bottle or the can, are meant to be served at cellar temperatures. Those cellar temperatures are low 50-degree Fahrenheit range. Jeremy, help me out. Would you have a Celsius?
So that would be in the ballpark of 10 Celsius. So it is, it's a bit warmer than refrigerator temperature is a great way to think about it.
Yep. Very well done. Thank you. And then so you'll notice if you hold a glass, the hand surface area is covering more of the glass, and that helps warm it up more. So that glass is really, truly meant for these English British bitters. And I love drinking them out of a true no-nick pint.
Yeah. Another glass that I would love to drink them is a dimpled pub mug, where it's a big mug, you've got a handle, and it's great when you're trying to play darts and not spill your beer at the same time. That's another variation of that as well.
Yeah. So I'm going to do a faux pas and step away for 3 seconds to get a book right behind me while Jeremy waxes poetic on his ideal pairing, but I still am here and listening. I'll be back in 3 seconds.
Okay. I guess I'm up. So pairing wise, this is a beer with all those flavor notes that we talked about earlier, the caramel, the toffee, the bread, even the nuttiness of it. What I especially loved is an aged cheddar, because an aged cheddar can actually start turning orange, and you get these nice, wonderful salt crystals that form in there. But there's also just an undertone of butterscotch through some of that cheese, and it goes incredibly well with these beers. Some of my favorites would be like a pot pie, whether chicken, beef, or something like that. Just the way that the buttered crust comes across the top works really well with this. Fish and chips is a classic with these beers. And if you've ever had a chance to eat Scottish eggs or make them yourself, which is super easy to do, that's another thing. It's just a hard-boiled egg with sausage wrapped around it. Maybe it has breading or not around the coat around it, but then it's just baked. It can be fried, and just that savory nature goes really well with just this earthy black tea, orange marmalade, wet earth type of flavors that come out of this beer. Those just right off the top of my head, those are classic. Those are delicious, and if I never went any further beyond those pairings, I'd be a happy man. Julia, how are you on the food pairings with this particular beer?
So well described, Jeremy, and I love when you bring out that orange marmalade from the malt, from the hops, and it really that is a indicative style characteristic or flavor characteristic of these styles. So with that, you also mentioned fish fry. I'm going to read from my beer pairing book, mine and Gwen Conley's, just as a little bedtime reading. If you're daytime drinking and listening to this, pretend it's bedtime.
It's story time with Julia. Let's do this.
It is. I'll tuck you in. So will Jeremy. And it ties to Jeremy bringing up fish and chips because it's one of my favorite classic styles. Country indicative, too, because the English taught us to love fish and chips and ESB together or bitter together. So the fish fry. The best party I ever hosted was a Friday fish fry in my old mountain town of hometown of Nederland, Colorado. It was one of those parties that hit the mark for me and fired on all cylinders: friends, food, fun, and drink. My now husband and I had just started dating, and we decided to bypass the ever-popular potluck in favor of a fish fry for our friends. We brewed homebrew for it, too, of course. We made an English-style extra special bitter. We kegged half the batch and bottled the other half. We bought the best cod fillets we could find and used the ESB in the fish batter recipe, too. With about 50 guests, as the evening went on, the fried fish got more and more flavorful since the oil became increasingly seasoned with each fillet that swam amidst the greasy heat. When the keg kicked that night, we moved on to the bottle-conditioned ESB. I remember going to snag some of those bottles from a hiding place under the stairs and offering them up to guests while the height of happiness and aroma of frying fish oil filled the air. The flavor harmonies of the ESB, extra special malt, caramel, biscuit, honey, earthy Maris Otter notes, the breading in the fish batter, the fried oil were simply simpatico. The beer and food fell into each other, and this is one of my favorite lines, like two high school kids on their third date. And I haven't even mentioned how the earthy English hop flavors found its way to the dill in the tartar sauce. Trust me when I say, once you go homemade tartar, you never go back. And so there's just so many layers to get to know of the breading and the malt in the beer, the earthly, English hops falling into kind of almost being a seasoning for that fish batter, the tartar sauce with the essence of tarragon really also acting almost like what the hops do.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of good to get to know. Have some of these British bitters and fried fish, certainly, please.
And that just brings up the whole thing is that this is not a beer or a style to study. This is a beer or a style to thoroughly experience. And it is, I'm half British. I'm a bit biased, but it is one of my, and always will be, one of my favorite beers.
Well said. And with that, thanks for listening to Sense of Beer Style. I'm Julia with Jeremy here, and we couldn't be more happy to talk beer with you. And cheers to you each in your beer journey.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
And me, Jeremy.
Tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.